Elden Ring is the biggest game of the new decade, and so far it's the highest rated game of the new decade. When I first got my hands on it, and beat it a week later, maybe a bit too fast, the only flaw I could think of was the PC performance. After taking some time for the hype to wear down, and having what I would assume is enough experience with the game to put out all my thoughts, the game's issues become very clear, and I'm doubting if it deserves such a ridiculously high rating. I won't be focusing on any positives. Everyone knows by this point that this game is really good after all. But I don't feel like enough people are talking about the flaws that I'm going to discuss. Disclaimer, this is not a review, don't mistake it as one. Also, major spoilers for Elden Ring ahead. Continue at the risk of tarnishing your first playthrough. Out of the over 100 bosses, only 13 of them are required, and of them, 3 are hardly full-fledged bosses. Out of all the content in a game, the required things should be the most fun, because every person will experience it. Not counting these 3 quote-unquote mini-bosses, how many of these bosses are actually fun? Of course, this comes down to opinion, but I will include what I take as the general census as well. Margit, Godric, Morgott, Boraloo, and Radagon are all bosses people like very much. I also love Malekith with all my heart, and I think he deserves more love. All of the bosses not mentioned, and also to a lesser extent the Death Doggo, are not popular. The only ones that stand out as explicitly bad are the Fire Giant, Godskin Duo, and the Elden Beast. And if you do the math, 30% of the required bosses are not good. What's up with that? I won't go into a lot of detail with how these bosses are flawed, but the Fire Giant is a slog if I've ever seen one. It goes on, and his moves are boring, and he has too much defense. The Foreskin Twins, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about already, reek of bad boss design. They took 2 bosses, who have no reasonable synergy other than lore and theme, and put them in a room together. And the Elden Beast is a horseback battle without a horse, because most of the boss fight is trying to reach the damn thing to get a couple hits off. I even tried the boss after doing a bit of hacking to allow a horse, and I can confirm it's a lot more fun, even if some attacks just straight up one-shot you. The other reason a lot of previously mentioned bosses and a lot of side bosses are mediocre or worse is because they feel loosely balanced for spirit summons. And when they are, it's very poorly balanced solo, and vice versa. Summons make most bosses a cakewalk, including Malenia. But some of these bosses were clearly made for someone using summons. The biggest problem is summons do nothing except make the bosses easier. There is no downside, as opposed to summoning another player, which makes the boss have more health. I beat Boraloo on my first try in my first playthrough because I wanted to use a cool summon I found. Then, on my second playthrough, I didn't use a summon, and I had a bloody hard time. With a stronger build, I should add. These bosses were clearly designed for a duel. In comparison, the only time the idea of the Godskin Duo is even slightly reasonable is when you have a summon. So here we are, with a mechanic that makes some of the bosses fairly easy, and an intended mechanic in others. A good comparison to how summons affect the game is adaptability in Dark Souls 2. For those of you who don't know, it's a stat that dictates how good your dodge roll is. On paper, this sounds pretty good, but in practice, it messes up a lot of the game. In Dark Souls 2, the developers have to design bosses' attacks around what you might have, whereas in the other games, they could very safely assume everyone had the same dodge roll. If a player never leveled adaptability, a lot of bosses would be super hard. If they maxed it out, a lot of bosses will be super easy. This is the same thing with summons in Elden Ring. The devs have to guess what you're using, and make the boss accordingly. For the Godskins, they went with the assumption that you might be using a summon, but for Malenia, they certainly assumed you didn't. This makes it so encounters cannot be properly designed, because the developers have no idea whether to design them around summons or a one-on-one fight. Because of this, I feel like summons were a bad idea. And if players wanted to beat a boss easier, they can always summon other players. That's a mechanic in all the other games. But spirit summons were just unnecessary, and it made the game more unbalanced. Remember how there were at least 100 bosses? Say for a moment we cut down all the optional bosses into only unique encounters. Most of these bosses are awesome. The Falling Star Beast and Deathrite Bird are kinda pissy, and Melania gives me conniptions. Otherwise, every boss is generally fun, especially for side content. The real problem arises with all the repeated bosses and enemies. There are like 15 of these guys, and 10 of these guys, and these guys. And this guy is just the stray demon from Dark Souls. 4.5 Godskin Apostles and Nobles, 2 Godric's for God's sake, 2 Astels, 2 Godfreys, at least 3 Falling Star Beasts, 4 Deathrite Birds, 8 Dragon Reskins, etc. It's even worse when a basic enemy is remodeled as a boss. Like, come on. This is the biggest problem with Elden Ring. They have so many boss battles, and they don't have time to make them unique. They end up adding a big health bar to enemies, putting 2 of something in a room, or shamelessly reusing a main boss. Reusing Astel is nothing but an offense. I suppose, in their defense, the game is huge and they already spent at least 4 years working on it, plus a delay. But this? What if you skipped the entire underground, made it to this mine, and found Astel just there? No build-up, no starry arena, no lore reasoning. To put it into numbers, there are 9 total unique bosses. What a joke. I'm not lying when I say I wish this game had less bosses in general. After all, most of the bosses seem like they're there simply because they felt like they needed something there. That's not all the problems that arise with enemy variety. The overworld enemies are reused more than the bosses are. Very rarely do you see an enemy in one area of the game, and no similar enemy elsewhere. The soldiers and knights are the most prominent examples. All the way from Caelid to Altus, you see reskins of the same enemies. And these enemies are the most common ones. No, don't do that. The knights are also just reskins too. At least make the elite enemies different, aside from enchanting their weapon or using thunder. The game has twice the enemy variety of Dark Souls 3, which is cool, but it's also 5 times the size. Another smaller thing to add is that a lot of the dungeons, especially the catacombs, all feel the same. It's the exact same enemy, who are also just thralls from Dark Souls 3, the same traps, and a hidden lever somewhere. Only a few of the dungeons or caves ever felt unique enough to be high quality, and these are few and far between. Imagine if every cave was as unique as the Sage's Cave, and every catacomb was as cool as the Lindell Catacombs. That would be an overall better experience. Doing a small dungeon like a catacomb normally ends up giving you something you're never going to use. The other thing it gives is runes, the amount of which is almost always scoffable. Same with enemy encampments. The rune rewards are not worth your time at all, especially when you can just get 100,000 runes by beating a helpless dragon to death in the first hour, which is about the amount you would get for doing all the starting area dungeons combined times 2. Doing the vast majority of side content is something you're probably not gonna do after your first playthrough. The only time it is ever worth it is for the fun of it, or if it has a specific weapon in it. And with how many throwaway dungeons there are maybe 3 dungeons that you will do out of interest after your first playthrough. I've beaten this game 5 times now. By this point, it might as well be a linear game, because I have no reason to go to 90% of these places. For this video, I wanted to focus only on the negatives. I may make a review later and add it to my tier list and all, but I wanted to point out all the flaws that less people are talking about. I think this game is awesome, but it's super important to me that the stable game of From Software for the next long while is as close to perfect as possible. But after taking a critical look at the game, and other people's thoughts as well, I just thought I should make the video about the game's major flaws, most of which cannot be fixed by now. The bosses are the most important thing to get right in these games, as they are almost always the most memorable things within these games. And I think that it's a shame that this game's general boss quality is closer to Dark Souls 2 than any of the other games. The only reason I feel like its bosses are held up is the generally good combat and the spectacle of it all. If you disagree with me, fair. A lot of these bosses are really cool after all. I'd like to hear your opinion in the comments. Finally, I want to say sorry for being inactive so long. I gained 8 subs somehow, like what? I'm at the funny number now, and this motivated me to start up again. as well as pestering from some of my friends and important people in my life. I hope to bring you more interesting content in the future. If you have any advice for what I could do to improve my videos, I would love to hear it. And that's the end of the video.